Greetings, I'm Nancy, and my husband, Roger, will be sharing this story with me. Before we dive into the details, I want to recount a rather unpleasant experience. My first encounter with Roger's parents, Virginia and Doris, was nothing short of a disaster. Their harsh words still ring in my ears. They couldn't believe Roger had chosen me, someone they deemed a loser. In their eyes, I had nothing to offer, just a basic desk job in a small office. They didn't think I had what it took to build a good life with Roger. But Roger stood by me, insisting that love was far more important than material wealth. His parents, however, were relentless, focused solely on financial status. They made it clear, if I didn't meet their standards, I couldn't be their daughter-in-law. They even urged Roger to find someone else. I was shocked, but Roger didn't waver. He told them he was committed to marrying me. When he revealed his plan to propose, I was stunned. While I'd hoped for a future with him, I hadn't expected it to happen so soon. But beyond that, it was Virginia and Doris's attitude that truly shocked me. Roger had warned me about his parents before. He said they weren't exactly the nicest people, and I was probably expecting too much. I didn't take him too seriously at first. I thought maybe they were just tough love types, hard-working people who faced difficulties raising him. But seeing their reaction firsthand was an eye-opener. Roger's words now seemed like a warning I should have heeded. Nancy, Roger said, you have to understand the truth about my parents. They may have helped put me through college, but it wasn't out of kindness. It was driven by their greed. They've always wanted me to marry into money. They see my future wife's wealth as their key to an easy life. I used to be blind to it, but now I see how selfish they are. My parents, on the other hand, were wonderful. Even Roger agreed. Despite his strained relationship with his own parents, he still supported them financially. They used guilt as a weapon, reminding him of the sacrifices they'd made. When I finally met them, I realized just how toxic they were. Despite Virginia and Doris's objections, Roger proposed, and we got married. Although they threatened not to attend the wedding, they showed up, albeit reluctantly. Roger had to convince them, stressing that I wasn't some destitute orphan. Their attendance was only secured and they learned my father owned a house and some property. It was clear, they only cared about what they could gain. At the wedding, they made no effort to hide their disapproval, lamenting that Roger hadn't married into wealth. They even admitted they wouldn't have come if they thought I had nothing. They made it obvious that my father's assets were the only reason they bothered to attend. On my wedding day, I made it clear that my father was healthy and in no need of inheritance talk. I wanted the day to be about my marriage, not money. But hearing Virginia and Doris's cruel remarks about my father's possessions broke my heart. It was a moment I couldn't forgive, though I chose not to tell Roger, not wanting to ruin his day. I knew how difficult it was for him to cut ties with them. Unfortunately, things only went downhill from there. While Roger and I were happy together, his parents never stopped meddling in our finances. Virginia and Doris constantly pried into my father's wealth, their behavior dripping with greed. Ignoring their questions didn't stop them, and for years, we endured their interference because Roger wanted to maintain some relationship with them. Their demands for money drained our savings, their guilt-tripping and manipulative tactics endless. They never stopped harassing me about my father's estate, and it became unbearable. I brushed it off as best I could, but when my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer, everything came crashing down. Living far away, Roger and I flew to visit my father several times during his final months, but Virginia and Doris were never pleased with our decision. They criticized us relentlessly, claiming that spending money on visits was a waste, especially considering my father's hospice care. Their callousness was astonishing. They even suggested that since my father's passing was imminent, we should be saving money rather than being by his side. I refused to accept their warped logic, firmly stating that visiting my dying father was not a waste of money, and reminded them that how Roger and I chose to spend our finances was none of their concern. You have no right to make such demands, I said. Our money, our decisions. Their response was even more outrageous. We're your in-laws, so our opinions should matter, especially if it's for your benefit. In our view, it's wiser to invest in people with a longer future ahead of them. Their cold-hearted remarks left me furious. My father's health was deteriorating rapidly, and their indifference only added to my emotional burden. Anyone who has experienced the loss of a parent would understand the overwhelming pain I was facing. Yet Virginia and Doris seemed completely incapable of empathy. Instead of supporting us, They implied that we should be focusing on their financial needs rather than being with my father during his final days. Thankfully, Roger intervened and shut down their inappropriate comments. Despite their cruelty, this only strengthened my resolve to deal with them on my terms when the time was right. Sadly, my father passed away just 4 months after his diagnosis, leaving me heartbroken. Watching his health decline had been excruciating, and though I had known this day would come, nothing could prepare me for the loss. Roger stood by my side, my rock during this difficult time, as we traveled to my father's hometown to make the funeral arrangements. During this already painful period, Virginia and Doris bombarded me with questions about the inheritance and funeral expenses, showing a complete lack of decency. While we were disgusted by their behavior, Roger and I decided to hold off on confronting them. We knew they would eventually face the consequences for their actions. And sure enough, as soon as we returned home, Virginia and Doris wasted no time. They immediately cornered us, asking intrusive questions about my inheritance and making assumptions about my father's house. Their insensitivity left me speechless, and Roger was visibly frustrated. "Nancy, stop being so melodramatic," Virginia snapped. "Ever since Roger married you, we've all wondered why. You don't have an impressive job, and frankly, you're not much to look at." Mason and I couldn't help but speculate, maybe it's about the money? Roger was livid. "Mom, what is wrong with you? How can you insult me and my wife like that? We married for love. As I've told you over and over, at least have the decency not to bring this up now." "Oh, Roger, don't be so dramatic. We're just asking your wife a simple question. She can answer, and then we can move on. Frankly, we'd be thrilled if you married her for financial reasons. It would be wonderful to know you've secured such a prize." "Are you seriously accusing your own son of being a gold digger?" I shouted, my anger boiling over. "You two are despicable. I can't believe a man like Roger came from people as vile as you." Virginia waved her hand dismissively. "Enough of the small talk. Nancy, tell us about the inheritance. This is the moment I've been waiting for. Roger mentioned your father had a large house, so let's hear it. Buy us a house, and we'll make good use of the money. After all, we're your parents now." My blood boiled. I stared at them in disbelief, rage coursing through me. Roger was just as stunned. The sheer audacity of these people, demanding my inheritance barely a month after my father's death and claiming they were my new parents. It was beyond comprehension. At that moment, I knew I couldn't let this slide any longer. For years, I had endured their greed and manipulation, but now, it was time to take action. I had put up with Virginia and Doris for Roger's sake, but it was time to expose just how insufferable his parents truly were. I decided to speak up. "Actually, my father didn't own the house when he passed away. He had to let it go a while ago for various reasons." Mason looked puzzled. "So you're saying your father no longer owned the house?" "Yes," I clarified. "He did own it a long time ago, but he had to part with it recently. Therefore, I didn't inherit the house or any substantial estate, as some might have assumed." Doris chimed in with a smirk. "Oh dear, so your father was financially strained after all. I always suspected you weren't wealthy. He couldn't even hold on to his property until the end. It seems you have nothing to offer." Roger snapped in anger. "Our marriage isn't ending just because there's no inheritance. You can't ruin our relationship over something so trivial." Mason cut in harshly. "Roger, don't interrupt. We're not going to allow you to continue this marriage. You've let us down by marrying into a less fortunate family. You never considered our feelings. I'm ashamed of you." Turning to me, Nancy said, "I'm sure you tricked my son into marrying you. People like you use deceitful tactics to snare men. Your real plan was to cut us off and enjoy my son's wealth." "Well, Nancy, I won't let that happen." Mason and Doris relentlessly pressured Roger to divorce me, insisting he marry someone wealthy so they could live the luxurious life they always dreamed of. Roger was breaking down, and I knew I needed to help him make a decision. I confronted him, asking if he was willing to let his parents manipulate our lives in such a way. I had kept my concerns to myself, respecting his guilt over severing ties, but it was clear that something had to change. Roger expressed his frustration, admitting he had reached his breaking point. He recognized his parents' true nature and how they had exploited him for years. He concluded he could no longer tolerate their demands. Despite Roger's resolve, his parents continued to insist that divorcing me was for his own good. They argued that they hadn't supported him all these years just for him to be generous with someone else. They pressured him to start anew, promising to support him if he sought a wealthy wife. They insisted he had already made too many mistakes. I will not abandon my wife simply because she didn't receive an inheritance. I refuse to be manipulated any longer. I've decided to stay with Nancy, and both of you are no longer welcome in my life, Roger declared. Why are you holding on to Nancy? Doris demanded. This isn't what we envisioned. She's completely unsuitable for you. If you stay married to her, we want nothing to do with you. We won't support you if she potentially robs you and leaves you in financial ruin. I stepped in, facing Doris and Mason. Your behavior is appalling. I'm going to set the record straight. I anticipated that revealing my true net worth would make you beg for money, so I decided to lay everything bare. I don't need to exploit Roger for money. I have more than enough of my own. You don't need to lie to make yourself look better. Mason sneered. We know the truth. You come from a modest background, and your job doesn't pay well. You'll probably end up targeting Roger's wealth when you're in dire straits. Contrary to your assumptions, I retorted, I'm not just from a modest background. I have $80 million in my bank account, inherited from my father, not earned from my job. Doris scoffed. Don't try to deceive us. Your father had nothing in his name. As you said, your lies won't work on us. We'll make sure you divorce our son and leave him to us. Despite Roger's fury, he signaled for me to continue. Understanding the gravity of the situation, I revealed my bank account balance, and Mason and Doris were stunned, insisting it must be a fabrication. You claimed I didn't receive an inheritance and that my father didn't own his house until the end. So where did this sudden influx of money come from? I responded, what you didn't know was that my father owned a significant ranch where he lived. He sold both the ranch and the house before he passed away, providing me with an early inheritance before entering hospice. He didn't want me using my own money for his care, unlike your assumptions. Mason and Doris were clearly taken aback, struggling to accept this new information. They looked at each other in disbelief, then suddenly their demeanor shifted. They expressed relief and joy, now pleased that my father had left me financially secure. They admitted their previous doubts, claiming they had misjudged the situation. They insisted that, since the financial aspect was resolved, there was no reason for me to leave Roger. They even went so far as to say they now considered themselves like my own parents. Seeing that my point had been made, I chose not to engage further in frustration and let Roger handle the situation. Roger, visibly upset, confronted his parents about their audacity to demand financial support. He reminded them of their earlier threats to end our marriage and criticized their abrupt change of heart, asserting that I was now family. His parents backtracked, offering apologies and attributing their previous behavior to their misunderstanding of the situation. Despite their apologies, I firmly rejected any idea of reconciliation. I expressed my deep resentment, emphasizing how their actions had disrupted my mourning for my father. Their behavior had caused wounds too deep to heal or forgive. I believe enough time has passed, and given the contempt you've shown toward me, there's no reason to keep you in my life. I'm prioritizing my own well-being and that of my wife. Therefore, I'm insisting that you leave my house immediately. Any thoughts of returning in the future are out of the question. Financial support from me will cease, as you no longer deserve any assistance. Mason and Doris reacted with desperation, begging us not to cut ties. Unmoved, Roger even threatened to involve the police if they didn't leave our home immediately. They eventually departed but continued to bombard us with calls and messages, leading us to block their numbers and warn them of legal consequences if their harassment continued. In the days that followed, Roger took charge of managing the fallout with his estranged family, giving me the space to grieve properly. Reflecting on my father's life, I was struck by his profound kindness. Despite my reluctance to move, he sold his property to spare me the burden and used the proceeds to cover his hospice care, a testament to his selflessness. Although I deeply miss him, I cherish the memories of the wonderful person he was. Meanwhile, Roger faced his own challenges, grappling with grief for different reasons. Although freed from his toxic family, he endured criticism for abandoning them. However, these judgments faded once he shared the full story, revealing the true nature of Mason and Doris, which left everyone who knew them appalled. Despite our efforts to sever contact, changing locks and blocking numbers, they persist in their pursuit, leading us to consider obtaining restraining orders. On a brighter note, amidst the turmoil, I've recently discovered that I'm pregnant. While it's sad that my father won't be a part of my child's life, Roger and I are finding joy in preparing for our little one's arrival.